Hey folks, I think pinged Rita and Max if they can join.
Hey Alex, this is Andrew. Did you know if Max was going to be? Oh, there's Max now. I was going to say I didn't see anything on his calendar. Morning, Max.
Good morning. How are you?
We could hear you, which is always good, right?
Right? We'll see how long it lasts.
Hello.
Hello.
Oops, I was speaking on mute. I think Zen read a few items, but I'm not sure if he's able to join. Jay, did you want to start on the enforcement actions? Or I can. Jay, can you hear me?
I at least can hear you.
Yeah, let me get started. I'm not sure if Jay can hear. Yeah, so we took the existing doc, I think mostly Xander, and simplified this a little bit. So this is just basically things that are available today. So just like the warn and deny case. So wanted to run if this makes sense for everybody. So this is basically the option 4 from the previous doc.
Yeah, it makes sense. I left a comment about what was it? Excluded enforcement points. Just if we accept star, but this also would be.
Yeah, I think we dropped that one on this one because it didn't really make sense to have both inclusion and exclusion at the same time.
So it would be kind of like match criteria, right? The use case being I want to enforce this everywhere but admission, say.
Yeah, I think the problem, I'm trying to remember, we discussed this one, was what was it? I'm trying to remember now. Now it's escaping me. I think it was something about like it can add if we were there were like star in the exclusion one. Something to that one, but I don't remember now. I'll have to come back to it. I'll add a comment somewhere. So Max, are you saying we should bring back the exclusion? It should be inclusion and exclusion at the same time?
I think we'll want it. I don't think it necessarily has to be in the first iteration, right? Like it's not like that functionality already exists, right? So it wouldn't be a retrogression or a regression, and it could be added later without breaking the existing design.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think the idea is, for starters, the enforcement actions would be deny, and what else did we say? Warn, and the enforcement, and then I think we can add pops up at a later point. And then the enforcement points would be webhook. We can call it validating webhook maybe to be more specific, or do we want to have just a webhook that covers?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. Like one, I think we're bound by the syntax of the old enforcement action config here, right? Just for backwards compatibility reasons. In that I don't think, nor do I think we want to say that this is like an enum, right? And I think the K8s docs, like the API design docs, kind of agree here, right? That in order to support backwards compatibility, you never want to say that you support all the things. So, or sorry, that is, you never want to say that everything that's there is a tautology, because you can confuse clients at that point, right? If you add something later, right, and they're using some older version of the code, and I think just yeah, I'm forgetting there's some other argument they had for enums. I think we could still do the validation behavior we have, right, to split the difference. But yeah, we would probably be shooting ourselves in the foot in a couple of ways if it were bounded.
So I think this will be a new field, right? The enforcement actions. The current one is called enforcement action. So I think we would not look at the enforcement action if enforcement actions is defined.
So that would depend on how we handle backwards compatibility. The way that the K8s API suggests it be handled, it wouldn't work like that. It suggests that enforcement action should be copied to enforcement actions. Maybe there's other ways of handling it.
Oh, so you're saying the action would be the same as the enforcement action?
Yeah, it would become the first entry in enforcement actions.
And we would do the conversion. Right. Is that right? So we would copy it when we create the constraint.
Yeah, it would be. I mean, you kind of know how K8s is, right, with the internal representation stuff. And if you wanted to do version conversions, like I think the notion is that if you wanted to create, say, a v2 constraint, you can't really get rid of enforcement action singular, because there could be some v1 constraints that would then be unrepresentable unless you had some behavior like that. I put a comment in the doc linking to the specific. I'll paste the link. Their recommendation for making a singular field plural, which is roughly what we're doing here.
Any thoughts about actually renaming the field altogether? Like changing action to actions? I don't know if it's still like confusing or could be confusing.
Like, are you saying the fact that it sounds close, or are you saying we should just delete action and have actions?
No, like I think because of backward compatibility concerns, you're gonna have side by side for a while, right? But I'm just thinking like because they're so close to each other, I wonder if actually renaming it all to something completely different might actually be better to reduce confusion.
Maybe. I mean, I could see arguments both ways, right? Like it's less confusing in the sense that they have basically the same function. So if they were named something very different, then people would be like, wait, why is it so different?
But to your point, if the new field is if it capsulates the old field, I feel like the additive here is enforcement points. So really the new field is enforcement actions and points.
I wouldn't call it that specifically, but
But I'm saying it's not just action, right? Like if we're dissecting this anyway, naming things is hard. I'm just trying to think, how can we make the migration easier?
I mean, or we do the other idea. I don't want to go back to that one, but so it's like webhook/audit, webhook/ like dry run, whatever. So keep the existing enforcement action, no other changes, but instead of the values being deny, warn, dry run, it will be audit/something.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of just delaying pain at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So it is
also you have to parse it, like as opposed to this. I like what it is right now because it encloses like the old one as part of the new one. To Max's point, I like that. It's very straightforward, like the new one actually has the old one in there. It's just I don't know enforcement actions with the S is a good enough of a representation to highlight the, like now we have an enforcement point, enforcement points.
And we can't call it something else.
Yeah, that's the only concern I have, and maybe I'll add a comment here.
New enforcement.
Like I could also see like when people are creating an issue, they complain about enforcement action. We'll have to be like, can you clarify? Are you talking about enforcement actions or action?
I mean, there I would kind of hope everyone just paste their constraint anyway. Because more often than not, if people try to describe things without specifics, like you're just relying on their description being accurate, and it's not necessarily true, right? Like something's not in alignment because otherwise it would be working. 90% of the time, there's something wrong with the config.
How about enforcement mode or something? Like just a different word.
Maybe I don't know. I don't know if I have the energy to like name like
Surely.
but I will say I think there's like precedent here. I forget which way the precedent leans, but in CRDs, right? Because it went from, what was it, validation to versions, version. You know what I'm talking about? It used to have just a single schema, right? And then they moved to supporting multiple schemas. And there were a couple of other changes in there as well. I think storage version got like bundled in, served version maybe. This would be old work, right? This would be before V1 custom resource definitions were a thing. Maybe before even.
So you're saying there are prior art that does similar things to change from singular to plural that we could.
I mean, there's the scenario is on the Max's doc that he just pasted, making a single.
Does it give specific examples?
No, I think it's just like a generic Frobber thing. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know CRDs did it. I can't think of any other off the top of my head. But I also don't make a very careful study of when Kubernetes plurals things.
Hey, you're not writing a book about it?
I'm gonna get so rich.
Lucrative business. So okay, we are okay with moving the existing enforcement action under the action, right? Enforcement actions that action, and then introducing the enforcement points, and then those going to be audit, webhook, getter, and star for starters, and then we can add pops up to that one.
Right. The having it be bounded is, as I said, a bit of an issue. Like we could import the existing semantics. It would also be good, I think, just for enforcement points to support actions that we haven't considered. Right. And there's kind of no way to do that without having some kind of unbounded field. It does hurt like validation.
You mean the star in this case?
I mean, let's say that we hadn't contemplated PubSub, right? And someone decided to add a PubSub valid action in some shift left binary that they've written. Right,
You
like
mean the enforcement point, right? For PubSub? Not action, enforcement point.
no. Well, PubSub isn't an enforcement point, right? Because nothing gets enforced on PubSub. It's an enforcement point takes an action that is publish an event to PubSub.
Let me look at the other docs. Oh yeah, sorry. The action is PubSub. Sorry. So okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so action it would be deny, warn, dry run, PubSub, like logs, that sort of stuff, right? It's not here, so.
Right, and so I was trying to create an example of if someone has an action that we have not contemplated. I think we want to allow room for that.
You mean as like an unbounded action, like define your own sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of making 2 points. One is I think we're in that boat anyway because of backwards compatibility. But then also, yeah, we probably want the unbounded thing because we don't really want to make it so it's only us who can hook into this thing. And also, like a third point, if you want, would be it's just a general K8s API recommendation. Like I can find the link.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do this. We do several unbounded action today, so that will automatically be in there. I don't know if anybody's actually using it, but we do support it.
Right. Okay. That's all. Yeah. If we're gonna like just import the same behavior, then I'm good there.
Yeah, I think because of backwards compatibility, to your point. Yeah, I'll let a comment on that.
What was that? No. Aha, there it is. Of course, it's a link to. I can't read through this whole thing right now. It looks like the text may have changed, but this is talking about new enum values from the backwards compatibility perspective.
And then are we okay with the star for the points?
I think we need it for backwards compatibility again, if we're taking that approach of the enforcement action becomes enforcement actions or whatever name we choose.
So by default, everything will be star unless somebody like exclusively defines it. Makes sense.
The star is only for enforcement point, right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay, got it.
And then
Take off the enforcement actions.
Huh?
What was it?
What did you say? Sorry.
I just phone the president, launch the nukes. Also send a warning.
More warning.
do we want exclude like in the future? Do we want exclusion also to have a star, or should that be specific? Because also, what happens if there's a star and a star? No up.
Well, if we're okay with deferring, then or the adding of exclusions, then we don't really need to answer that.
Yeah.
For
This is just me curious. Yeah.
I would for symmetry keep it like. Yeah, there's an edge case where users, if they put star, that effectively like nullifies that enforcement action. But it's kind of an obvious error in my opinion, right? Like there's nothing subtle about if you exclude everything, everything's excluded.
Right.
It's like when I hit myself, I hurt. Well, don't, but for symmetry, I wonder too if someone will find some like use case for it where they're like temporarily disabling an enforcement action without like deleting its existence or something like that.
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it's a good idea. Okay. Any other questions?
I'm just making some
Oh,
comments about updating the scope to maybe for now exclude call out exclusion for action and enforcement point is out of scope for now. Also, I had a comment, the enforcement point, since it's new, right? Like, is that going to be added as like the audit results as well as the logs? Since that's net new.
I think those are, so the logs will be an action.
Well, no, today we have action, right? So enforcement point is new. So my question is, do we need to add it to our log, to the logs and the audit results?
Well, I mean, the irony there is audit is an enforcement point, right? So if audit isn't part of the enforcement points, then it wouldn't raise an error. It doesn't completely nullify the consideration, right? Like, would people be interested in, hey, this constraint that is enforced everywhere is being violated, is more important than this constraint that's only enforced in audit is violated.
I think that might be
not
more,
clear to me.
to your point, maybe more relevant for logs. Like meaning this violation was caught for webhook versus audit or both.
Which would hopefully be implicit just in the logs aggregation, right? It would show, for instance, Kubernetes would be audit process versus webhook, audit pod versus webhook pod.
Uh,
I wouldn't be against adding it. I just
maybe
personally
more-
would wait until someone asked, but
Okay.
it's also not harmful if it's added.
Okay. No, to your point is it's not like it's a bug or anything, or like a degradation or anything.
Can you add that as a comment, Rita, either in the doc or in?
I added in the comment. Sorry, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, either in the meeting notes or in the comments.
I added a comment.
Thank you.
And then to Jay's question on the side about like having like different constraints with different action and enforcement point and exclusion, namespace exclusion. This is still the same, right? Like all constraints are just like and together. So whichever is more strict will basically get applied, will win basically.
Well, I mean, they'll wait. Sorry, if are they competing? Are there two constraints? Which question is this?
I think this is like around if there are multiple constraints and if like the third constraint for pod has deny action, enforcement point is star, and ought to run for a cube system namespace. Which
Yeah,
one?
so
Right.
sorry to cut you off, but can I
Go ahead.
yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so there I was just basically thinking about conflicting constraint, and let's say like in the example with the combination of two constraint, we can basically disable the audit for cube system namespace. But what if there is a third constraint that says that uh, enforce everything on cube, enforce everything everywhere? So that's, I was just contemplating on how specifically for cube system namespace we should evaluate after combining all the constraint, what should be enforced and what should be not, because uh, as I understand, like right now with the combination of two constraint we shouldn't be running audit, but when there is a third constraint saying that we run everything for cube system, how do we make that decision of running audit or not running audit, or running webhook or not running webhook, for example?
Right. So, the idea would be this enables or disables the constraints on the particular enforcement point. Not that it would enable or disable the enforcement point altogether. There is like a more fundamental architecture concern here too, where if you needed to know the set of all constraints before you could reason about the appropriate action to take, there's a very real eventual consistency problem that comes with that, right? So let's take your example and kind of invert it, right? Like there's this there's these three constraints, right? And let's pretend that your rule is if 2 out of the 3 don't want to enforce in cube system namespace, then you shouldn't enforce in cube system namespace. Kind of a weird condition, but let's just go with that. Now let's say, you're spinning up a new gatekeeper pod, right? So the first constraint that the gatekeeper pod ingests is, hey, we should enforce against cube system namespace. At that point, will be enforcing against cube system, right? Then you add in that second constraint that is not enforcing against cube system. Well, now it's 50-50, so we haven't met that threshold, so we're still enforcing against cube system. Now we add that third constraint, and we are no longer enforcing against cube system. So that can lead to kind of surprising results in the sense of if I want to reason about enforcement, right? It's the addition of new config reduces the enforcement scope. Maybe a clearer example. Sorry, this will get rid of the eventual consistency stuff. Let's say you have shared control here, right? Like let's say that you're running some infrastructure team and you've come up with this like shift left workflow where there's some source of truth repository for like policies for the whole cluster, right? And then there's a second source of truth repository, or like n source of truth repositories for individual teams so that they can create policies that affect only them. If what the existence of one constraint can undermine the ability of a different constraint to be enforced, that separation of concerns doesn't necessarily work, right? Because then if I'm a malicious maintainer of one of these team repositories, if I know I could flood the zone with some sort of like ignore constraint, right? Then that will disable the cluster constraints, or at least one of them. Then I know I have the power to bypass policy, even though that wasn't the intent. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So instead of going with and, it should be or, where every constraint, whatever they specify locally, should be and like followed.
Right. Yeah, and Rita, under the current regime, yes, it would. Right. Like the idea is that everything gets enforced. Like the overarching logic is that every new constraint whittles down the state or the set of resources that are valid to be right.
Well, I just
Or
want to clarify Jay's example, right? Where as long as there's one constraint that denies for cube system, then that constraint will always be flagging or blocking, right? So even if there were other like hundreds of other constraints that excluded cube system, for example, that particular one is always going to flag the offending resource. So,
Yeah.
so you are right, it's an or, not an and. I'm sorry.
And so like, you know, if let's say you had 2 or 3 matching constraints, one said, well, you should deny, one said, well, you should warn, and one said, well, I'm actually just dry run. All 3 actions would be taken, right? Like there's an assumption here that actions are not mutually exclusive, which is, as far as I know, true, right? Like in Kubernetes, you can deny, or Kubernetes admission webhooks, you can deny and send a warning. And then dry run is just an internal thing, right? That just gets logged and put to metrics. So,
but again, I just want to clarify, this design does not change the current behavior in any way. Like I want to make sure, since Jay, you brought up the question, I just want to make sure it's clear to you that this design doesn't change the how people are expecting this to work today. That behavior doesn't. Okay.
So today it's still or, right? It's not and.
Yeah, it's always or. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, I confused.
So yeah. So then the example needs to change, because like in the example itself it says that like it's contradicting a little bit, or because in the first for the example that is there, disable audit for a constraint in a single namespace, right? We are excluding cube system namespace from anything, and then we have another contradictory example saying that enforce enforce webhook and getter everywhere. So I guess that's over, I think, right?
Well, if we're looking at the example, and maybe either this was like either Xander wanted to show that we're updating the existing constraint, whereby it is, you know, the existing constraint now behaves differently, in which case the most up-to-date change will win. Or to your point, maybe we're missing an example here that shows what happens when you have different constraints. What is expected behavior?
I think what is your point that the example as written doesn't do what it claims, which is say audit will not be performed on the cube system namespace for this constraint.
Yeah, from the first glance I got confused, but I think like if it's or in between both of them, then it makes sense. Like first constraint says that don't run anything on cube system, and the second one says that run only webhook and getter. So like doing or for both of them makes sense that it results in not running audit for cube system namespace, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I will say there is a little bit of if people don't like the duplicate results, right? Because if namespace is not cube system, you'll get rejection from. Oh, they shouldn't. They also shouldn't have the same name. You'll get rejection from the top constraint and the bottom constraint. You could just basically make sure that the match criteria are the inverses of each other. Like in one, excluded namespace is cube system. In the other, the matched namespace is cube system. Right? That would be one way of handling that.
Yeah.
That could get kind of awkward if the selection criteria for forming the set of excluded resources is complex enough. I don't know how common that would be. And the prior art I could think of there is just writing a rego function, right? Because it's essentially the same thing, right? When you write a rego function, if you're declaring it piecewise, right? So you're writing the same rego function multiple times. You need to make sure that only one function returns for any given input value, or that if multiple return, they return the same value. Otherwise, that's a runtime error, right? And so you wind up with those same tricks. You basically invert your criteria across functions to make sure that only one will ever cover any given use case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. So that part is now clear to me. Thanks.
Time check, since we have a few more agenda items. Are we good with this just for initial implementation?
Yeah. So and I had just one more question. Thinking when I was thinking about multiple constraint, could there arise a condition where right now, since we are moving enforcement action under enforcement actions, right? Could there be a case where we need to have two different constraints to enforce the current behavior that is for one constraint, like that is satisfied with one constraint?
Anything that took one constraint now takes one constraint now would take one constraint in this design.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's just if there's something you couldn't express currently, that may require more than one constraint under the new regime.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have another question since we're talking about backward compatibility. Is there any So in terms of migration, so let's say for dry run, because today dry run explicitly includes audit. Is there any plans for are we creating the enforcement actions with an existing enforcement action, or this is purely user driven?
Like, I think we talked about this. By default, we're gonna copy the current actions, and then it'll be the star as the enforcement point. So it'll be like whatever whatever user inputted, we would transition to this system. But if somebody wants to disable audit specifically, they would need to edit the enforcement points.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, dry run, actually, the webhook does take a dry run action. It's just a very quiet one, right? Like, it's so dry run basically means this constraint will not send anything back to the API server, right? It won't reject, it won't warn. It may, I forget the logging logic, but I think if you've enabled logging, it will write a log entry. And it will definitely increment Prometheus metric.
Okay, sorry if I missed this. Is that default behavior, is that somewhere in this doc?
I put it on the meeting notes, just
Okay.
when we were discussing, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it might be
So
good to
I
include that.
said, yeah, so exclusion is done in the first iteration, we move action under the enforcement actions at action, and then default star for enforcement points for backwards compatibility. And after that, users can edit and change whatever they want.
Okay, got it.
I think that's a good transition.
So does that mean when this feature is available, are we creating enforcement actions resources? Sorry, are we creating those enforcement actions for users?
There's some nuance there. I forget where K8s landed on this. Because if you, like, so you're talking about someone has like a YAML, right? And they kubectl apply it to the API server. And then what does the YAML look like after it's applied, right?
Yeah, so today everyone has enforcement action, right? So as soon as enforcement actions is available in, I guess like as a feature flag, let's say they enable it, is the controller going to add the new enforcement actions for the user automatically?
I would kind of defer to the backwards compatibility doc on this one, and I can't remember the details right now because there's a lot of like weird stuff there, right? Like if I could tell you one thing that is subtly broken, right? Like if we just add in like the enforcement actions and then be done with it, right? What happens the next time someone applies let's say they edit that original config, right, in that original YAML and then kubectl apply it, right? Are there now two enforcement actions, or should we like clobber the first one, right? If what we do is we delete the enforcement action and we copy it over to enforcement actions, right, it becomes even less clear, right? Like what is adding this new intent? I assume they've thought through all of those edge cases in the backwards compatibility guide. Again, I did not like do a super deep refresh when I put that link. I just knew it was directly on point.
Okay, so maybe Jay, if you could add a section for this so that we can come back to it, that would be good. So we have,
For backward compatibility?
yeah, like what are we doing in terms of like migration? Are we explicitly asking users to do this, or is there anything that we are doing on behalf?
Okay. Yeah, cool.
And if we were to do it on behalf of the user, when to do it and how to do it.
Yeah.
Like this all may be prescribed, but we should definitely look at it ourselves. And that
Yeah.
making a singular field
Just
plural.
thinking about some of the enhancements in K8s where we're introducing new things, we are actually creating the new thing based on the old thing, and they're kind of running in parallel. That way you're like basically silently transitioning them over.
Oh yeah, here we are. Upon any update operation, including patch, if singular is cleared and plural is not changed, API logic must clear plural. Rationale, blah, blah, blah. If plural is cleared and singular is not changed, API logic must populate the new plural with the same value as the old. If singular field is changed but not cleared and the plural field is not changed, API logic must populate plural as one element list with blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so they've decided on certain behaviors here. It's not obvious to me that those are always like logically backwards compatible. There may be some fudging, but that's the
Which one was your
recommendation.
example, Max? Like the enforcement actions exist and then somebody does kubectl apply. That's if the singular is cleared, the plural is not changed, right?
There were 3 bullet points. Here, I'm just gonna copy.
Yeah, I just pasted them in the chat.
Oh, also, do we talk about the future of enforcement action? Are we deprecating it in the future?
I mean, I would assume, like, has Kate's they've kind of stopped removing old stuff, right? Or
It
like
depends.
one way we could do it, we can't remove it from V1. I think that's pretty clear, Kate's wise. You can create like a V2 with it gone, provided.
But constraints is beta, right? Is it? V1 beta 1, I think, isn't it? Yeah, V1 beta 1.
Yeah, we never did V1 for that one.
I would treat it like V1. I think both because that's the guidelines for beta, and because the point of the V1, like the do not remove a field thing, is so that people who just aren't paying attention never break. People who are paying attention and are annoyed by the old format can like increment the version and never have to deal with it.
Well, if we're never deprecating it, then I would argue we need to have a way to automatically translate it to the new.
I mean,
Well,
we don't touch it. It stays at V1. We just introduce V2 with this change.
so V1 will need the new thing, 100%, because, or V1 beta 1 will need the new field, the plural field, because the Kate's backwards compatibility stuff is like backwards and forwards compatibility, right? Basically, without adding the new field to V1 beta 1, if you did that star conversion, right? Like, let's say we only added it to, let's call it V2, just to be like super clear. So only V2 has enforcement actions, nothing else does. If someone specifies like 5 enforcement actions, and then you go to your internal representation and then you convert it to like V1 beta 1, you will have lost information. And that's just a non-starter in Kate's land.
What happened if we didn't convert? What happened if this is just a new thing in V2?
Yeah, whether
Like
or not
it's an
we
explicit
convert is
thing.
not up to us. Like the API server will it's the one that governs that conversions need to be possible, because clients can run kubectl get at whatever version.
Right. So assuming the new again, I think I think it's coming back to me the compatibility stuff. It's been a while since I looked at that. If they are side by side in V1 beta 1, right? Like again, because we're not deprecating the old one, I think we need to be able to create the new one from the old one. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, but the new one doesn't necessarily need to have, if you had V2, presumably you would be able to delete the singular field under these rules. Like the version conversion stuff just requires that the intent be maintained, right? And there is like a little bit of implicit data that is like kind of like, so let's say you did a round trip thing where you had a V1 client, or sorry, V1 beta 1 client creates a constraint, right? It's using the singular field. It gets converted to a V2, right? Let's say our controller is reading and writing V2 now, and then written out again by our controller. Presumably that singular field, we should keep that value because if the original client wanted to update that field, right, with server-side apply, field ownership, all of that, changing the enforcement action singular should completely wipe and replace enforcement actions.
Yes.
And that's what these bullet points are trying to get at, I think, is describing those behaviors that handle those nuances across version conversions so that you can drop the singular field. But as I said, I would not want to on the fly try to find the edge cases there because this is very complicated.
Okay. But sounds like there's more to discuss with respect to how and when to do the new to old conversion.
Well, yeah, I would assume that this API changes doc has a reasonable set of behaviors. I don't necessarily like taking things on faith that because Kubernetes put it there, it's necessarily right. But I do think it has probably had a lot of thought put into it and probably has been battle tested somewhere. So it's more likely to be right than not. But it's also multiple paragraphs. So yeah, we should definitely like offline think through it.
Yeah. I guess my point is I don't think we can figure out in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Do we have time for the next one? Probably not.
And I could stay. Is it true that I can stay? Yes. If we wanted to, is someone blocked on either the next two?
I think the next one we had that user issue. I think they are blocked because we changed the behavior for the constraint template compilation, so that the behavior is different.
The behavior is different. Honestly, we should never have added that behavior in the first place. Like if someone was relying on that behavior, they shouldn't have been, because it would never reliably occur, right? If the gatekeeper pods were down, then they wouldn't see this rejection message. And putting the expectation that we would fully validate code on adding a constraint template was wildly optimistic when you consider adding in multiple different languages, right? Like even if Rego always compiles quickly, which I don't think is necessarily a given. We don't know how Rego will change over time. We don't know the shape of every single inbound constraint template. And I don't think Rego cares so much about compile time for latency, like instantaneous latency, high bandwidth concerns as they do evaluation time, like the runtime of the actual Rego, right? So just like organizationally, there's some decoupling of assumptions that seem brittle to me.
Right. I think that they're suggesting if we can add a flag or something to restore the old behavior.
I'm suggesting we should just take the lumps and remove the behavior. Like there's so many problems with it. Multi-engine now. The multi-engine stuff, if you the way that code was written, it just assumed Rego, right? And the constraint framework, when we added multi-engine, had some logic to determine which version of the source code should be used, right? And you can imagine if someone were to apply a constraint template that had invalid Rego for our particular version, say they're using a new feature that Gatekeeper doesn't have, or their version of Gatekeeper doesn't have, but they're also using VAP, and that would be parsable and executable, and the default assumption is to use VAP, why should we raise a Rego error, right? Because everything is still actionable, right? And so either we're left like duplicating that logic, or we're expanding the constraint framework to like bake in this expectation of run precompile. That's one issue. Another issue is a lot of like fundamental errors that can happen in constraint template code. They're not compile time errors, right? Like I gave the example of partial functions before, right? Like let's say I wrote a Rego function was like, is one greater than the other, right? And I, for some reason, wrote that as a partial function that returned two conflicting values for a certain input. You're not going to hit that error until you get that input, right? So the mere fact that it passed doesn't necessarily mean you have valid code, right? And so
Quick question.
Well, go on.
Even for a cell, right? And I'm putting on my KK hat now. Even for cell, right? Like, don't we still want to give some kind of warning if there is a known compilation error? Like, not the runtime error, but like if you wrote a bad cell expression, for example. So I agree, don't like assume it's Rego, but even with cell, like wouldn't there also be
I think the difference is like it's in the constraint template status versus like a validation.
Yeah.
So this is just the validation part. It's not that we're not giving that compilation failed error. It is where
is when you do it, right?
Right.
Right, but I think as a Rego or cell author, when the way I interact with Kubernetes in this case is by deploying the constraint template. And so I think it would be valuable to see like, oh, your code actually has a compilation error, like as soon as I deploy it. So that is the
should you do that like live edit in the Kubernetes cluster instead of using things like Gator?
Again, I'm advocating for the user here, right? Like I can see both sides, right? So I'm just being the devil's advocate right now.
Yeah,
right.
I would say too that if we build this expectation on users that we will reject stuff with invalid Rego and or whatever source code, and they rely on that expectation, we're setting them up for failure, right? Like let's say there's this that's the only error signal they're looking for, right? And gatekeeper happens to be down because the cluster is being upgraded or whatever, and they apply a template and they don't receive a rejection. Like, okay, cool, this must have worked, right? And then like 3 months later, they check status and like, oh, this totally isn't working. We've given the impression that we have a system that is more capable than it actually is.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong, I definitely see the value of having the status, you know, at runtime, right? To catch all the, to be more authoritative and complete. Like I 100% agree with that. I'm just saying this like kind of fail early thing, right? Where I can see the policy author may be relying on the early detection failure mechanism today. And I agree with you, yes, they should be using Gator, but for the sake of argument, let's say they're not for some reason, because to your point, this is the existing behavior, right? And yes, we're taking it away, trying to do the right thing, but it was there, so, and now it's gone, and now they don't have a way to detect or have early detection.
Well, we have alternatives for early detection, as you pointed out, right? Like Gator does exist. We're removing early detection in a specific workflow. And I would counter that with, let's say we add in another language that has like a 5-second compilation time, right? And it starts to be problematic for things like controllers. Do we want to bind ourselves to this expectation for all arbitrary new engines, for all arbitrary changes that Rego may undergo, right? Like let's say in service of cutting policy evaluation runtimes by like 1/10, Rego decides it's worth 5xing the compilation time, you know, because it required like adding a lot of like indexing to get there. But you know, the high volume path for OPA would be the inbound validation, right? Not the adding or removing of Rego.
I mean, like the loading and compilation step for Rego is quite important to us. It's done whenever there's a change to a bundle or whatever. So that is an important thing for us to maintain. I don't think it's going to spiral out of control. I mean, I see where you're coming from. I see what you're saying. I understand like the challenge around doing all the stuff at admission, but I don't know if it's necessarily accurate that we would really consider such a change.
Okay, so specifically, it's so it is within your concern that the if compilation were to degrade too much, you would be concerned about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So like as soon as there's any change, so there's no like incremental compilation. So as soon as there's any change to any policy, it's to be loaded into any OPA instance that's been loaded over the bundle service API, like we need to recompile everything. And yeah, that's something we obviously want to do quickly. So, but yeah, no, I see where you're coming from, but I think like that's something we would try and maintain without sort of spiraling out of control. I think that would be, at minimum would be something that we'd have to have a flag for if there was some additional step. We already have the additional optimizer flags you can pass for Rego compilation. So it would be some option, I think, if we were ever to consider something that would make it take, say, that much longer.
Now, is the compilation of Rego in the critical path for anything, or is that kind of like happen in the background and OPA continues to serve?
No, it is done in the background, but it's still important to us that it happens quickly, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I hear you about, yeah, no one would intentionally make their thing worse, but there is a value trade-off there, and this previous behavior that Gatekeeper had puts our infrastructure in a little bit of a different place than Rego did.
Yeah, I suppose like I can see conceptually like this is something that you might not want. Like it's well understood, this kind of issue with what you do with webhook admission time and so on, and in particular if you're doing a lot of these requests or having a lot of updates to these objects and doing the compilation and so on, and it taking time. But I don't know if it's not likely that that's going to get like masses and masses longer all of a sudden for Rego, I would say.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, there's also just arbitrary languages validating admission policy. Was WASM, whatever else. The memory and CPU usage would also be a concern, right? Like compilation is not traditionally a super cheap thing there.
Yeah, this is something that we have people raise around, but we're usually talking about like pretty large. I suppose it in a kind of OPA deployment, it's all managed differently, and often people are working with quite large volumes of data and policy kind of all bundled together. Whereas the kind of compilation and processing for a single, often in the gatekeeper case, like a relatively small Rego policy, it's not maybe something I would be too concerned about, because we're traditionally in the OPA use case of a larger policy bundle working, we're just like in a different way. So
right, sorry, I wasn't necessarily highlighting OPA specifically here, or saying OPA has high memory usage for consumption. I honestly don't know if it does. I was more saying that webhooks get invoked in parallel, right? Like for every inbound request, like if I do kubectl apply constraint template 50 times in parallel, that spins up 50 parallel server responses, right? And so you're running that compilation time. You're running that compilation 50 times at a time, right? Which the standard sort of approach here would be to either like not have complex logic in the critical path of your web server, or to throttle it, right? So that you're not starving each individual process such that it will never complete. My preference for something like validation, given all the other potential issues, would be to avoid the starvation case by just not having that complex logic.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. I was just highlighting sort of how I see things from like the Rego side, but yeah, I appreciate that there's various other considerations for this use case.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't like a rejoinder to anything that you were saying. I was more just continuing on the like myriad reasons why for the validate. Honestly, I regret ever approving that PR. That should never have gone in.
I am curious how many users are affected by this, since it is like a behavior change, I guess.
Yeah,
that's my concern, like for just the behavior change. So if somebody were relying on it, now it's like, oh, we changed it.
Well, but again, we're if they were relying on it, they were already vulnerable to something like this happening, right? We've made it 100% likely versus like say 5%. But
yeah, I mean, I get your point about like long term. I'm just trying to think, what do we do to help users in the interim?
I mean, that's what the flag suggestion is for. So like, and then we can say, hey, this is going to go away. So just you can use this one for now, but in the future this behavior is going to go away, because we changed the behavior without actually like transitioning anything. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, updated to 3.13, now it's different.
Yeah.
Well, experiment, right?
Yeah, if we wanted to add a flag, that would be good, or good, to me acceptable, right? Like it would be nice to give users an option there.
And we can announce it, say like, hey, in 2 releases, this flag is going to go away.
But
And
that's
then
kind
this
of
is
what
going
where I'm getting at is like long term, I think we are all in agreement. I think it's just because we didn't give people enough time. This it just sounds like it's not a good experience. So could we bring it back for a couple of releases so that we give them time to migrate and do the right thing with Gator, for example?
Maybe. So the
Maybe.
yeah, okay. So the elephant in the room would be VAP, right? Like, part of the reason that code went away is if I just create a VAP only constraint, or I create a constraint template that uses Rego, but not in the standard field where you expect Rego to be. The way the webhook validation code was written, if I remember right, certainly the VAP only thing would be broken, right? It'd say, well, your Rego's invalid. It's like, well, that's because I don't have any. I think where it read Rego from may have been brittle. I may be misremembering that. But if we're okay saying like, hey, before you use VAP, you should really disable this. And there is some like contention, right? Like, for users who just want to adopt VAP, no, we've added a new step, and the new thing will be broken, or we have what we have now.
Could the flag be Rego only?
With the problem is that if the flag is enabled, right? So we're inheriting the old behavior. The old behavior would break for VAP, right? Like,
no, I mean, as in like the flag is invalid for VAP, like it doesn't. It's just for Rego.
Like we just limit it to Rego, and then if you see you're trying to use VAP, we give you a warning or something, or we error out or something.
We would need to, well, VAP is for a specific template, right? We don't like enable VAP globally. We do disable. Actually, we enable the existence of VAP globally or not.
Yeah.
I could also imagine us allowing preference order at some point. Right, like, so if the constraint template has Rego and VAP, which would you like Gatekeeper to use? So basically, how I interpret what you're saying is, for constraint templates where we would use Rego, right? Whether it's because Rego is the only option or because Rego is the preferred option over like all the possible engines. We should do this preemptive validation. And so we will wind up copying that logic. So yeah, it's either there's a bit of logic duplication that may be slightly brittle because the engine selection happens in constraint framework, not in Gatekeeper, right? And the webhook would have to basically infer engine selection. Or we have this use case where if you want to use VAP, you should disable the flag because you'll get Rego errors. Or we have the current thing.
Okay, for the sake of time, does this sound like we are okay with bringing it back and error out if they are using the experimental enable K8s, like the VAP flag? Are we okay with that for now? And then have like in the release notes, make a big note that this behavior will go away in like 2 releases or something. And the recommendations use Gator. Are we okay with that going forward?
So you're saying without trying to do the selection and just have VAP broken with the flag?
Yes. So basically what Andrew is saying, right? Like when they use this, the VAP feature flag will error out and
If that thing is enabled, yeah.
Where do we error it? In the logs?
Like I would assume you would just crash loop. That'll get people's attention.
Yeah.
That's going to be very confusing.
these 2
Yeah.
flags are not mutually exclusive. You cannot have both of them enabled at the same time. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with that. My hesitation would have been like if VAP, like if someone was already using VAP before, right? Presumably this new flag would be defaulted to enable the validation, right? So that it's like a hands-off, users don't lose functionality immediately. That would mean that current people who have enabled the VAP flag will find themselves crash looping. But it was experimental.
Yeah,
So
I'm not loving that, but it is experimental.
yeah.
I mean, I was going to say, Max, if it's my understanding correct, like the VAP between 3.13 and 3.14 isn't really the same shape anyway. So, you know, if it's, there is no 3.14 out anyway. So it's, I don't, my guess is not that many people are hopefully trying to use this VAP in any sort of really, I'm hoping they're not using it anywhere that's actually important in production. We'll just put it that way. So I suspect it's it's very unlikely that this is going to be a problem. That's my guess.
Yeah, I think experimental is even in the flag name, right?
Yep, I put it in the notes. That's what Rita was reading. Is yeah, it's actually literally experimental enable K8s native validation. And like I said, I know the 3.13 version is not the same as it's going to be in 3.14. So there's kind of a little bit of a breaking change in it anyway. So it is very pre-alpha.
Yeah.
So I put it in the note. So add a new flag for the regular compilation. We default to true. And then we crash if the VAP flag is enabled at the same time.
Yeah.
And then also add like release notes and
add to release notes. Oh, are we okay to cherry pick this for 3.13.1?
We have to.
Right?
Okay, 3.13. Yes.
3.13.
Why are we having this conversation? I guess.
Right.
And make sure we have it in the code, like a to-do or something to remove in 2 releases. This is what we do for K8s, right? Otherwise, we won't remember.
Yeah, remove in 2 releases.
So 3.16 or 15.
Gone in 3.16, right?
Yeah, gone in 3.16. Yeah.
Sounds good. Cool.
Cool. Everybody happy with the transition?
Do we know who wants to do this?
Let's add an issue. People can volunteer.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can sit on that.
Yeah. Do we have time for the next one?
I think we're already like half an hour over.
No. Since you're already here.
Well, I think that's a pretty quick one. I think the answer is just yes, right?
Famous last words.
I just want to, I just want to make sure, like, because the design doc, as well as all the issues, as well as the docs all talk about audit only, whereas the code is supporting emission, right? So if the cache works for webhook, then all the docs and issues should be reflected as such.
Yeah, I think when I was implementing it, I sort of did it for both. But actually, we have implemented it at the framework level. So I am not sure how we can segregate it at webhook and other,
Yeah.
I mean, the audit level.
For the record, I'm not suggesting we should change the code. I'm just saying there's inconsistency.
Yeah, you just want to know what the
Right.
reality is given the documented
I
history.
want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what this feature does and make sure it's clearly communicated.
Yeah, so I think, oh, good.
I was gonna say like I also added the website documentation. I think it says both, but I can verify that. But I'm curious where else we wanna change it. Like should I just update the issue in a design doc saying that we have this for both?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
That's one of the outcome. And because if you look at the website, the doc and the issue, they all say for now we're just handling the audit.
Yeah, that
Okay.
oh really, the website does too.
Yes.
Let
The
me
website
read.
literally says audit response. I can link to find it.
Yeah. If I remember right, that was like audit. We were like thinking maybe we wanted to avoid TTL.
Do you remember why we didn't want to? Now I can't remember the history. Why it was we said audit only.
It was like cache scope thing. So audit, you had like an audit token, essentially the timestamp of the audit runtime, and so you could scope the cache to a specific audit run, right? And that was like very clear that that could be done. Whereas webhook, how you might want to handle cache expiry was a little bit more vague, but we just decided to go with TTL anyway, so it was mooted.
Do we want to disable this? Because there's no disabled behavior today.
Yeah, exactly. So the way I've written is like the cache will always be on. We are only validating the TTL. So if TTL is 0, we are returning the error in the setup. Otherwise, the default will be taken or whatever values are required.
Yeah, can we use 0 as a disable? I mean, I can see this being valid for like a CI use cases where you don't want this.
Do we want to do 0 as a disable, or do we want
Or
to
it could be
leave
like
flag?
-1 or yeah, any value.
Oh, I was saying, do we want separate flag or do we want to do this interpreted?
I think 0 for disabling makes sense, or like -1 or something. I don't know. As long as we provide it.
I mean, I can do whatever.
I mean, 0
I
TTL
have no
doesn't make sense,
preference.
but that's why it makes sense to just use it to disable. Like it's like 0 is basically like there's no time to live, so it's almost disabled. Same behavior.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Like if everyone agrees, like I can just make that change. I'll take that as yes.
Are we good with this? Yeah.
I'm fine. I added the action items.
Rita, you had concerns about the 0 as being disabled before. Are you okay?
I remember
No,
that.
I said no. I said that we need to validate that the TTL makes sense. That was my only comment.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like if you want to use 0 as disable, I think that's fine. And again, make sure it's clearly documented, right?
Yep. I'll add probably note on the flag itself, saying that 0 will disable this. 0 will disable the cache. Right.
You could argue this is a behavior change.
I mean, we were
Yeah.
erroring it before, so now we are just disabling it.
That's a behavior change.
That's why I was saying whether we should introduce a new flag. You can just say, hey, now there is a flag which you can use to disable.
Mm,
I mean, nobody was using 0 before.
Well, how do we
now
know
they
that?
can use it. So it's I would say a new addition, not a behavior change. You couldn't use 0 before.
Kind of makes sense actually.
yeah, but one was crashing when one is disabling the feature. That's
Right, but you couldn't use it. So like that's like it wasn't a use case before. So it wasn't like you could use it like yesterday and now we're broken.
Is
It
the
was only
feature not
crashing.
disabled if it's crash looping?
Is crash looping a behavior? Yeah. Anybody
That's a good
relying on the
point.
crashing?
but it's not just that feature. It's like literally the whole thing. Oh my god.
Yeah, we are just erroring out the entire setup.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It wasn't like a behavior to like a desired behavior to begin with.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just do 0 thing, I guess.
I guess it's early enough that if we change it now, it's probably not a big deal. But I would challenge us to cherry pick this so that that behavior difference doesn't live out in the wild for too long.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, you're saying we should cherry pick it or not cherry pick it?
We should if we're
For 313, right?
I mean, this is a
Right.
new feature though, not a fix. I would say.
but it again how long you want this difference to live out there. The longer you have it out there, the harder it is, I think.
I guess. I mean, yeah. Are there any happy users of the 0 flag right now? You know?
No, because it crashes.
Yeah, that's
Some
my
people
point.
like
Yeah,
counter co-op. I don't know. Was it?
that's my point. Like nobody can you even use this one with 0.
But I mean, regardless of 0 or not, like I think it would have made more sense to have a way to disable the feature though, disable the behavior. So I would be, I don't know, I would +1 on cherry picking it. Because this
I'm
got,
okay with either way.
this got introduced in 313, right? So it should have been released with the feature flag. In high,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so
Let's
cherry
get it.
pick to 313.1.
Are we okay? Are we all okay?
2 cherry picks?
No. Anyone objects? He asked a
I
different
mean,
one.
this is technically a new feature, but I'm okay with cherry picking. Yeah.
All right, cool. We're done with all the agenda items. All right, I gotta drop.
Yeah, same.
Thank you. Have a good
Cool.
one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.